Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. Welcome to Mercantile, Bombay, a journey of trade, finance, and enterprise, presented by the Gateway House, Bombay, Live History India, and Avid Learning. We're delighted to present this session around Sifra Lenton's new book that is being launched right now. The publication is part of the Gateway House Guide to India in the 2020s. For those who are joining us for the first time, a very special welcome to you. Mumbai is a crown jewel of India that attracts many star-crossed dreamers. What makes it so attractive? What makes the city the financial capital of the country? At Avid, we love nothing more than to learn more about our beloved cities from different angles, viewpoints, perspectives. As you know, we have many series on Bombay, Mumbai. Tonight's discussion will cover why migrants chose this city, the trade wars it survived, the fallout of the American Civil War, and how rivalries between local rulers, European colonial powers, merchant families shaped these tiny islands into India's most important port city and financial capital. Our panel of experts will discuss Mumbai's rich mercantile and trade history, right from the opium trade, the textile boom, to the Forex crisis, and setting up the Bombay Stock Exchange, and also the future of this financial hub as a special economic zone. Allow me to introduce our panel of experts. Associate Professor at the History Department, Sophia College, Dr. Rashna Poncha. Author and Bombay History Fellow at the Gateway House, Sifra Lenton. Author and former Secretary, the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Basil Sheikh. And they will be in conversation with our moderator, author, co-founder, and editor of Live History India, Minnie Menon. Please note the session will last 60 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A in which Minnie will be taking questions submitted. So please do ask them. Now put your phones on silent, take them out, put them on silent, and start using them. Start posting, reposting, tagging us at Avid Learning, hashtag Learning Never Stops. Thanks again for spending your evening with us here today. Over to you, Minnie, and look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asad, and a very warm good evening to everybody. It's so wonderful to meet people in person. So we've been doing Zoom events and discussions for the large part of the last 2 years, so it's really wonderful to see a house full on a discussion that really is something that, each of us can relate to. This is a city that we call home. How many of you are migrants like me into the city? Right. Okay, there are more people from here than migrants, okay? So, but, at some point we did come to the city. And I think, I think this discussion is going to be about what shaped the city. The thing about Bombay, or Mumbai as it is called today, is that very often this is a city that is looking ahead. Everybody's so busy making money, building careers, that it's one city that doesn't pause and look back at its history. And what a storied history it has, right? It took me 18 years after coming to Bombay, actually, that's when I realized how deep the history goes. Because if you actually look at the trajectory of Bombay's history, it starts, if you look at the larger Bombay metropolitan area, it starts from Sopara, 2,200, 2,300 years ago, and gradually moves south. And today we're going to be talking about the modern history of Bombay, but of course the late medieval and early modern history. So I'm going to start by talking about the three aspects that you have mentioned, Sifra, over here: trade, finance, and enterprise. These are the three pivots around which the city has been shaped, and the city continues to get shaped. But what I found interesting about the book is how you took a step back to see how the genesis of these three pillars were laid out or came into being. So I want to start by asking you about how you structured this book, the idea behind this book.
Okay, just a little background about this book was, this book was meant to be because I joined Gateway House actually to write this book. The book idea came from my two co-founders, Manjeet Kripalani and Ambassador Neelam Dev. because they were looking for someone to write the history of Bombay from the foreign policy perspective. That means, what were the geopolitical, economic, strategic events that shaped the city? So initially, when I sort of started, and they had considered other writers before me, but no one could sort of wrap their head around the idea. And it took me a few years, actually, also to understand what they said. And that's when I started thinking about the city from the sea. So I said, we are an island, and it's a city that really had not much to speak. It didn't grow anything really, except for having fishing communities, you know. And then I started looking at what made the city grow. And that's when I structured this book. Actually, the book starts with the sea. It starts with the port. It starts with the navy that secured that port. It starts with how the city sort of increased its hinterland to sort of supply goods to the port, because without a hinterland, no port city can survive. Then I looked at who were the trading community, who were the immigrants who came from overseas, who were the migrants, internal migrants who came to the city, what were the triggers for their migration into the city, and then what made the city a global financial center in the late 19th century till the Second World War. So this was the period, this is the way I structured it, but it took a long time, many really putting the idea together. So if you see, the chaptering of the book actually follows the structure, but the title, of course, says Mercantile Bombay, A Journey of Trade, Finance and Enterprise.
It all starts with a dowry, right? That Catherine
Yes, it
of
does.
Braganza comes.
But
I'm going to...
Yes, it does start with the dowry, but the history of Bombay really precedes that dowry.
Of course.
Yeah.
And as I said, 2,200 years before, because you do have the Elephanta, which is again a 7th century, cave complex.
Right.
But you know, this is a great way of starting the conversation, because that's what I stood out for me about this book, that you looked at Bombay as part of a larger network and how it was plugged in, and how it was it preceded cities like Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Singapore in its rise as an international center, which is very interesting. But I'm going to ask you, you know, logically speaking, one could ask, why would a port like Bombay stand out and become an epicenter when there were so many ports along the western coast? Surat was a great port in the Mughal periods. You know, you had so many of these ports in the western flank. What made it work for Bombay?
You know, Minnie, there were 2 or 3 things. One is history is not static.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a flow that happens. What we do when we are writing about history, or when we're talking about history like we are today, is the fact that we have to highlight certain dates, certain years, and certain events. Actually, they're just markers on a long series of progressions. Now, even when you say Bombay was, I mean, it wasn't termed as a global financial center. It was the most important city east of the Suez. That was what it was termed. So it was grew into financial center in the late 19th century, largely, and much before these other cities that we talked about before, say Hong Kong or Shanghai, Dubai, definitely, New York for that matter. But London was the main, you know, or the city of London was the main hub. Now, your question is that what made the city grow?
And what worked for the city?
And what worked for the city? Actually, there were different things that happened. I'm just going to put it very briefly just to give you all an idea. One of the things that worked for the city was the fact that Surat as a port city began declining. Because after the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707, Basil will tell you that, you know, the Surat mint was the most productive mint. And the Mughal emperors after that actually began farming out the mint. Okay? Surat was more insecure in the sense it was prone to attacks, there was instability. There can be no business where there is instability. So the East India Company began looking for an outpost which was outside Surat but close enough for it. It took a long time for Surat to decline. So you can't say that it happened overnight with an event.
But the tide had turned, so to say.
The tide had turned against Surat. It took a good 100 years for it to go down. You know, and then it came within, the British were ruling it from 1800 or administering it from 1800 onwards. So that was one event. The second thing that worked for Bombay was because Surat was so insecure, the East India Company actually shifted its headquarters here. Now, it wasn't that the Portuguese had not realized the strategic importance of Bombay. They had realized it, but they were already in decline at that point, so they didn't want to put in the effort to develop it. So it was sort of parceled out into leasehold lands. So when we talk, when the history of Bombay actually begins, we're talking about starting for the Portuguese period and the manor house.
Right.
So,
but even the
just
Portuguese,
yeah.
Sifra, chose Versailles as
Yes.
the base,
Yes.
not the seven islands. So my question was really this outcrop of the seven islands, how it became. But you've answered that because this was the epicenter of the British part of it, right? And of course the old fort. Now this segues the conversation into two aspects. One is the community that also came with the British from Surat, which is the Parsis to start with, because they were shipbuilders and then they came in over here and then they be part and parcel of the Bombay story. So, Rashid, I want to start by asking you about the early communities that came in. Of course, there was a pre-colonial kind of community, the Pathare Prabhus, the Kolis, all of that. I mean, it's a very storied past. But with this shift around 1678, when the East India Company decides to have Bombay as its headquarters in the West, what are the community? How does it start building a new community structure?
So for this, Minnie, we have to look back to, at least for me, one man, Sir Gerald Ainger. Because as Sifra was saying, Surat is losing its importance. But remember, Surat is an established port for hundreds of years. It was controlled when the East India Company came here by a very, very strong Mughal emperor. There is a strong Mughal governor. Everything is controlled and strict. So when the East India Company gets the chance to get these islands, there is actually nothing here. The Pathare Prabhus are there, the Kolis are there, yes, but they're small fishing or agricultural hamlets. And from that, we are converting over to this financial center we're talking about. And I put it all at Gerald Ainger's feet because he realized the value of this place. The Portuguese, I really don't think realized the value of this place. They had it for a long time, 150 years they held this place, they didn't do much with it. So it's when the East India Company comes here and Gerald Ainger, who's the second East India Company governor here, decides that he's going to settle it, expands berthing in the quay, builds warehouses, builds courts of law, and invites people to come. And what does he draw them in with? The promise of religious freedom. So one, you have a lot of trouble on the hinterland. So people are struggling, people have a very difficult time. Here is a place that is not connected to the hinterland so easily. You are a little safe pocket. Come here, settle this down. And so that's when we have Parsis and Jews and Armenians and Banyas from Gujarat and a whole load of people coming in because he has actually invited them and gives them that religious freedom. He's actually even given it in writing. There is a patent given to a Banya family from Diu who said, we will only come and settle here if you give it to us in writing that you will allow us to continue our religious practices. And he does that. And so you have these first groups of settlers coming here. But even at this point, it's still a transshipment port because it doesn't have a hinterland. There is nothing coming in from the mainland to Bombay. And Bombay is not growing anything, sorry. The soil is just not good enough. So it's this starting. It said that within the time period of Gerald Ainger, from 10,000 people, he expanded the population to 60,000, centered around the eight-shaped island of Bombay. He's fortified Bombay Castle. He has the Bombay Marine, which is helping him protect this from the Dutch and the French. And so that's where the beginnings are. But the first Parsi came here before the English came here. So you had Parsis coming from Gujarat. You had Dadabai Nana Boy sitting here working for the Portuguese. And slowly over a period of time, more and more and more Parsis started coming. And they settled here. They were traders to begin with. But the really big push comes when you have Lavji Nasarwanji coming. Right. And the shipbuilding yards bring in so many more people. So you'll find that all these immigrations come in waves.
Yeah.
So
And the
Gerald
waves
Angel.
continued, right?
The waves
Even
continued till post-independence.
Yes, absolutely. But this is such a fabulous point, the secular fabric that built Mumbai. And I think that's a factor that we must all iterate multiple times over because it's so important, because that really shapes this city. Now, the other aspect before I come to Basel is, of course, with no hinterland in Basel, what becomes very important is the commerce, the commercial movement of goods, right? And for that, finance plays a very big role. So in many senses, it becomes a financial center also because of these communities coming, this little network that grows. So what were the early years like, early centuries like over there?
See, since Bombay did not have a hinterland, it relied upon the port to serve as a transit point, as a transit and a trade point over there. So what essentially was needed over there were two or three, which Sifra's book very elegantly lays out, is you need security of person and security of possessions.
Yeah.
Secondly, what you need is that contracts. You have an ecosystem where contracts are honored. And where contracts are not honored, there is an ecosystem wherein contracts can be enforced. And where they are not enforced in a fair manner, you should have a dispute resolution system for a dispute resolution. And the money which you make in that area, you should be able to take out or convert into wherever you wish to go, at a low transaction cost. These are the preconditions which you require. And I think Bombay ideally provided this to poach talent. It poached talent from Surat, initially from Surat, and thereafterwards it poached talent literally from all across the world. And talent brings with it capital, it brings with it its networks. So you have talent, capital, and networks, and that in some ways is what attracted maybe in much later, of course, when in the later parts of Bombay, the Baghdadi Jews who came in and galvanized the city, the Armenians and the diamond merchants, etc. So they had a haven. So these were the simple preconditions, which in some ways, when you look at it, even the Parsi Mystery Report, when it looks at positioning Bombay as an international financial center. In 2007, they had come up with it. I think Sifra's book becomes an excellent case study which complements this. So the role of a credible currency and the convertibility of that currency was very important in some ways to take it forward.
The obvious follow-up to that, Basil, is the issue of the Indian rupee, which gets minted over here. But under Farooq Siyar, the East India Company also gets the mandate to mint the Mughal Rupee. How does that impact the movement of money, and what does it do to a city like this?
If there was one big disaster that ever happened, it was 1717, when the Emperor Farooq Siyar, outsourced the mints to private parties. Till 1717, you had a uniform currency, and a largely uniform currency, and there were multiple mints, but the coins were struck to a stringent uniform standard. After 1717, you had a total disarray in which hundreds of different currencies came into existence. The money changers made a lot of money in the process, but the economy, the transaction costs of the economy went up dramatically. Now, but very interestingly, it was after 1717 when Bombay started minting its, the coins in the. Originally, Bombay had started minting coins in the English standard.
Yes.
The coins were not acceptable. They had, they had the Carolina, the Angelina, the Copperoons, Tinny. None of them were acceptable. And very interestingly, they also went over to Shivaji Maharaj and said that, could our coins go current in your domain? And very sagaciously, I think that offer was declined during the negotiations of the British with Shivaji Maharaj, and I think there's a very nice painting which gives the British delegation and Shivaji Maharaj, wherein these matters of coinage were discussed. And virtually everything was agreed to except for coinage. It was so the farming out of coins was quite a disaster, but Bombay came into its own after 1717 because the Bombay Mint started striking coins to the exacting standards of the earlier 1 tola of silver, which was being struck, and the English, being a commercial company, realized the importance of coinage as an instrument of sort of proclaiming trust and integrity, trust, and which was very important to them from a commercial perspective of reducing the transaction costs. So the prestige of the British went up dramatically with the coins struck in Bombay, which incidentally had the mint name Surat, but commanded a premium over the Surat rupee. So they were masters at psychology and used money as an instrument to sort of propagate the greater glory of the company.
And the Bombay rupee had, the Indian rupee had a footprint far beyond the subcontinent. And I think that's a very important point to make also.
It had a footprint far beyond. It piggybacked originally on the Mughal Rupee. The Mughal Rupee had its trade routes along, as even the Sifra's book puts it very nicely, to the Middle East, to the Gulf regions, and from the Gulf regions also to East Africa. Yeah. So when the British rupee, the Bombay rupee was essentially there between 1717 and 1835. 1835 coinage was standardized in India, but the later rupee, it followed the same tradition, the same tola rupee. So it became almost like a trade currency in the entire region.
So
As a matter of fact,
they piggybacked on the Mughal network, which is so interesting, right?
On the
it's
Mughal,
so interesting. You never think of that. You think a lot of these networks come with the colonial powers because they have their, footprint, so to say, across different regions. But it actually piggybacked on that. That's a very
also
interesting
Aden.
point.
Later, Aden became a British protectorate.
Yes.
So the rupee became the thing. Then the Trucial States, it became legal tender in the Trucial States. And very interestingly, in German East Africa, the Germans wanted to introduce the Maria Theresa Thaler, which was which was a very popular coin in those days. But the popular opinion said no, it was not that. They wanted the rupee, and you have notes issued in German East Africa, Tanzania, Zanzibar, which are designated in rupees. And of course, leaving Bombay aside, you also have the rupee going right down to Indonesia, so it's the rupiah.
That can be a completely different
No, that's a
discussion,
different
but we will root it back over here. Sifra, tell us, this city has been shaped by the people who came in, and we talked about the multiple waves. You have the Khojas, the Bohri Muslims, the Bhatiyas, much later the Sindhis, etc. For many of us who've traveled across Bombay, can you tell us what Bombay would have looked like, for instance, in the 19th century, with the communities, their religious centers? Because what we don't often realize is that many of these communities came and made it their home, but this also became their cultural and religious centers. The Aga Khan moved here after all, So this became a place where communities kind of had the whole ecosystem of culture, religion, the finance, the economy, livelihood, everything coming together.
Minnie, that's an interesting question, because the fact is that supposing you visualize 19th century Bombay, you don't really have to visualize, because recently there was a lovely map exhibition at the Asiatic, and there was a wonderful map of the native town. And that was one map that attracted me, because in 19th century Bombay, you had the White Town, which was a British town, which was a fort area, where you had an intermingling of the Parsis staying there in Bazaar Gate and all. And then you had the native communities living outside. So you'd have the Baghdadi Jews and Armenians and the Parsis living within the fort broadly. I'm not saying there weren't other communities there, but the other communities largely lived in the native town outside the fort. So for example, when I covered, or a lot of my profiles of the communities are actually based on field interviews. So I visited, for example, I visited the Iranian community, I visited the Irani Masjid. And it's incidentally known as the Mughal Masjid in that area, because Persian was the language of the Mughal court. So they say that we are wrongly sort of identified as the Mughal Masjid. It's actually the Irani Masjid. So if you go to any area, you see, you can visualize 19th century Bombay. So Imambada Road is where all the Shia communities are, and you'll have 4 Shia mosques on that one road. And then right at the end, you will have the Irani Masjid, and you will have a hammam there. So you see that even, for example, Hammam Street within the fort indicates there's a hammam. There used to be a hammam there. But there is actually a hammam right outside the Irani Masjid, which is functioning. And I wanted to go in, but they said, ladies are not allowed. It's not exactly a palatable place. It's not meant for ladies to go in. So anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that every community had a presence in a certain area. A lot of Irani Shias lived on Imambada Road. Then you see the Khojas. The Khojas is just a lane just before that. It's where the Khoja Housing Society, as well as the community hall and all. So each community carved out a certain religious and more importantly, a cultural ecosystem. So you'll have the Bora community, you'll have the Khojas, you'll have the Ben Israel community on Samuel Street and Israel Mohalla, not the Baghdadi. Baghdadis were in Nagpada and Mazgaon and Baikala. You'll have the, so each community, each immigrant, and even Hindu communities, for example, you will have the Bhatia community in Kalbadevi area. So each community sort of carved out their own little space around their own religious structures, their own community structures, which were inevitably sort of connected to that, their own schools, their own hospitals. Like during the plague, for example, I attended a very interesting talk, and there was apparently a Beni Israel plague hospital or plague, institution. So every community, with respect to their diet, had their own little plague sort of recuperation homes or places. So every community had their, where they were housed was where they got the same kind of food or were with the same kind of people. So it's interesting. And it was not that they were intolerant. It's just that it sort of maintained a certain ecosystem, and at a time when there was so much, disease or likelihood of dying early.
Right.
So that's
but Sifra, this is interesting because those identities continue even today, right?
Absolutely.
Largely because the community might have spread out, but the religious institutions are still there.
Right.
And I think that is like a nucleus around which the communities are there. So that aspect of Bombay remains?
I absolutely agree with you, Minnie. Certain communities, especially the foreign communities, as I have explained in my book, like the Baghdadi Jews, there are just a minuscule number of them. The Japanese are no longer here in Bombay. The Chinese, after the 62 war, have immigrated overseas. So the foreign communities, overseas communities, have reduced. Iranian community is down to around 2,000, 2,300 or 400. And so all the foreign overseas communities have reduced. But the fact is, as you rightly said, their ecosystem still exists. So you will find the Baghdadi Synagogue, the Armenian Church. Of course, there are no Armenians left in Bombay, but the church is given over to the Syrian Orthodox order. It's still there. It's still managed by the Armenian order in Calcutta. So the connections with the city are still there. The properties are there. And it's still maintained by the few community members, and the linkages are there, Minnie, because you will see that those who've got Bombay roots keep coming down around December, January to visit. Whether it's the Chinese, whether it is the Jews, they come from every part of the world, and they come and visit where their parents or grandparents or ancestors were. So it's interesting to really, the connections remain.
It's a continuum of history, right?
Absolutely.
Rashna, tell me, what is interesting about Bombay's history is also, while on one hand you have this, the security, the communities coming in, the trade, progressing very well. It was also a little volatile on the edges, right? Because, you did have raiders coming. It was also a time of pirates. I mean, my favorite story is Malabar Hill, right? It was the pirates from Malabar who came over there. And you can't even think of piracy and, Malabar Hill being something. But even in Bandra, where our office is, we overlook the Ranwar Chowk, where there's a placard which says in 1700, there was a battle between Arab pirates and the villagers of that Ranwar area, and many people died. So it was a volatile space.
It wasn't always easy living. It
wasn't.
was as volatile as it is now. And even before the pirates were all along the coast. Malabar Hill was called that because there was a lookout point to watch out for pirates coming closer to...
They were not hiding under the
No,
rocks.
they were not there. The pirates were not. There was a lookout for the pirates. But even before that, you had a large number of people hopping across from the mainland, because remember, the Thana Creek isn't all that wide. And so you had the Siddhis coming here, you had other groups coming here, the Portuguese coming, the Marathas would hit, Mahim, etc. So there has been a lot of, I wouldn't say warfare, but it has been very, very difficult. But the main part that they wanted to protect was the southern part, where the port was. So the rest of it, they had sort of small dotted forts, and they had barges with cannon on it, sailing up and down the creek. But Bombay Fort was built to protect the town of Bombay. Actually, once Bombay Fort was built, they never really had that much trouble again. So it was the other forts that saw more problems. However, in the city itself, also there were problems. So you do have rioting from time to time, like the famous dog riots, as we discussed
And
earlier.
you must talk about the dog riots.
So
I don't know how many people know about the dog riots. It's
so
one of my favorite stories.
the government decided that there were too many, stray dogs running around and causing a nuisance, and so they went around shooting them. And the Parsis were up in arms at the fact that the dogs were being shot. Because, for the Parsis, the dog is very important because he will lead you across across the Chivard Pool, as we call it, the bridge, and into the better afterlife. So there was this huge hue and cry coming down to actual violence and fighting. And finally, the government gave in on the condition, of course, that something was done about the stray dogs. And so the Panjra poll was started, where they actually kept not just stray dogs, but even stray cows and animals that were wandering around in the streets. We also have the Parsi Muslim riots. And during the dog riots and the Parsi Muslim riots, people ran into the fort, and the fort doors were shut so as to protect them. So yeah, it has been volatile. Not that it hasn't been in 19th, 20th century.
I know, but that's a sadder story because, there's been so much of, division and divisive politics that has impacted the secular fabric of the city. And that's a very sad outcome, given the fact that the city was all about embracing people and communities. And I think this is what we need to iterate in forums like this. And I think this is the message that...
Yeah, I think the most important thing here is that for the longest time, this was a place where people of different religions, different languages, different cultures, you were all together. So like she's saying, the mosque is there and the other mosques are there, the Agyaris are there. There was no problem. In that sense, there was no problem. So people came here because of one thing, because they could make money.
Yeah, and they had the freedom to do
yes,
whatever they wanted. Sifra, the Bombay Marine is a very interesting construct because it becomes the force that protects, but it also has a modern day rendition because it's a Western naval base, and it was a naval base for the British. So I want to talk a little about this and how it kind of progressed over the years.
That's one thing I've really touched upon. In fact, I've devoted a chapter to that. A lot of people don't realize that the East India Company Marine Force from Surat, when they shifted the headquarters in 1687 to Bombay Island, Bombay Castle became the headquarters of the Bombay Marine. And the East India Company Marine was actually renamed the Bombay Marine. Now, the interesting part is everyone sort of is very vague about the history of the Indian Navy. They don't realize that the roots of the Indian Navy actually is the Bombay Marine. So it was from the Bombay Marine that it grew, that it became for many years it was the Bombay Marine, then it became the Indian Navy, then it became the Royal Indian Navy, then Her Majesty's Marine Service. So it went through different iterations in name, but the force was the same. And eventually, after independence, it became the Indian Navy. And then when the Indian Navy actually shifted headquarters to Delhi, which actually happened during the Second World War, but the Indian fleet was headquartered in Bombay. And later, in 1968, it became the Western Fleet, or the fighting arm of the Indian Navy. So one doesn't realize that this remained the only blue water or fighting. When I'm talking about a blue water fleet, what am I talking about? I'm talking about a fleet that can go overseas to fight. Now, this is important in the history of Bombay because the Navy was actually a bridgehead for territorial acquisition. Whether you talk about Sindh, whether you talk about Aden, whether you talk about subduing piracy in the Gulf, they either outright acquired territory or they went through the treaty way, which happened for the Trucial Coast. The Trucial Coast actually translates to the treaty coast. And they used their navy very smartly. So it was a key factor in making Bombay bigger than what it actually is.
What was the politics like among the presidencies between Bombay, Madras, and of course Calcutta being the biggest city outside London, right, for the British at that point, at the height? What was the politics like? Because, you know, what amazed me was I always looked at Malabar as being part of the Madras presidency, but there was a time when it was under the Bombay presidency as well.
You know, it's basically policy that changed. So initially when the presidencies were formed, there were three. That is Bengal, Bombay, and Madras. All of them were independent and all of them reported directly to London. Then what happened was that they formed, in 1773, the British government started exerting a little more control over the East India Company because they kept borrowing money from the government. And that's when, in 1773, they made Bengal a leading presidency. So Bengal started controlling Bombay and Madras, and there was a good reason for it, because Bengal was doing well. It had a huge hinterland after the Battle of Plassey and the Battle of Buxar, and it controlled so much land, it had great revenue, and Bombay was, well, it wasn't really prospering the way it should have, but it remained a sort of, for almost 70 years, was living on loans, as it were. I mean, I'm referring to the city as a living being, but that's the way I would put it. So I wouldn't say it was politics. It was just largely also a question of administration.
Right. Yeah. Two things happened that kind of, get Bombay up and running and a new avatar, so to say. The first is the opening of the Suez Canal, right? And the second is the American Civil War, because suddenly cotton becomes a huge commodity and Bombay becomes the place to actually have the mills, have the cotton which comes in from the hinterland. It comes into its own. What was that period like?
So you've got to go one step beyond that also. 1817, we have the larger presidency being formed and we get the hinterland.
Yeah.
We get the cotton growing districts of the Deccan.
Absolutely.
So once the Suez Canal is much further on.
Yes.
1830, you have the Borghat opening, which is bringing all that cotton from the hinterland to Bombay and being sent out from there. And Bombay's fortunes are going to change there, even before the US Civil War. So opium and cotton, opium coming from Malwa, cotton coming from the Deccan, both of these are making everybody here, including the East India Company, very, very wealthy. And then, of course, the Civil War. The Civil War is going to change everyone's fortunes. The Civil War is going to completely change Bombay's physical landscape, because that's when the fort will come down, because everyone has so much money, they want land to build palatial houses. So that's when the fort will be brought down by the governor. And the whole place, so what you see today in South Bombay is what was created post-1864. It took a long time. They thought it would happen within 20 years. Of course, it didn't. But the physical landscape also changes with all of this wealth flowing in. And despite the crash, because the cotton market just crashed and everybody lost fortunes, the opium trade still continued. Lots of people had invested a lot of money in real estate. A lot of the communities, Parsis, Banyas, etc., that saved them. Otherwise, how would Premchand Roychand come back from losing absolutely everything to once again becoming so rich? So these are the 3 points, where Bombay's fortunes change. The opening of the Suez Canal just makes it all much, much faster. because they already had the Red Sea route. Ships went all the way up to Suez, and from there you crossed by land into the Mediterranean. So that was a much faster route. But the opening of the Suez Canal, of course, made things so much faster. You could now bring ships, goods, money, mail, everything.
You know, we don't realize that peninsular India is actually very well placed. You know, we have this old map, Reshna, you would understand it, the Periplus of the Eritrean Sea, which is a Greek mariner's map of 1st century CE, and we've actually recreated it at Live History India. It has India the center of the Roman trade, because the ports of the west coast act as a bridge between, and at that time China was not known, but in the sense it opens up the east. And that's what happens to Bombay, right? That suddenly it becomes a very big player in this intercontinental trade that happens. So it gets linked up to Arabia, Africa, which are old connections that get resurrected in a big way. And that's also a phase where you have a formal finance, cross-continental trade, banking systems coming in Basil. So talk about that period, how the formal banking system starts being built out over here.
See, the driver for banks is essentially demand for credit and the scarcity of capital. That's where banks really come about. And interestingly, very few people are aware that Bombay was the place where the first bank along European lines, we don't say meaning banks, just banks on European line was set up. In 1720, it was set up. And it went on, it had a more or less reasonable existence and faded into oblivion around 1770s, around 1778 or so. Exactly at the time, very ironically, it faded away at the time when banks started mushrooming in Calcutta and in Madras. So it was a bit of a, there was a disconnect over here. And a very surprising fact is that between 1770 for almost 60, 70 years, there was no bank in Bombay, despite Bombay sort of after, as she says, after 1718, after 1818, Bombay starts picking up. There is the opium trade which is going on. No bank is set up till 1840. Now, it's a peculiar situation. The reasons can be very peculiar, that it was the paradox of plenty in some ways, because Bombay became slush with money, especially the supernormal profits of the opium trade. And what, to use a very unfashionable term, is, they call it primitive capitalist accumulation. It's not normally used today, this sort of word, but there was a lot of money which was happening, and it was resisted by, banking was resisted in Bombay by your local interests. So what happens is that...
Why was it? Because they already had some way of moving money through community channels, the hundi system, for instance.
You see, there was no issue about banking. The issue was about banks along European lines. That means, we see, when we talk of indigenous bankers were essentially of three different types. One of the high bankers, who dealt with high finance, like the Jagat Seths, and earlier in the olden days there was a V.J. Vora, etc., who engaged with the companies on their own terms. Then you had the, the people with, amongst cities, the Nagar Seths were there. And then you have the petty money lenders whom we see in film and cinema, the rapacious, etc. So, but banking essentially was dealing with there was the high banking, and they were as sophisticated. They did not lack instruments, they did not lack sophistication, they did not lack networks. What was different was that they did not accept deposits from the public, and since they did not accept deposits from the public, they were not accountable, so therefore the concepts of transparency and accountability were not over there. So modern banks brought in this business of transparency and accountability because they accepted deposits from the public, because then you are in a fiduciary capacity, you are accountable to people. That's where that's where the issue arose. But once the genie was let out of the bottle, Bombay became Bombay became a pioneer for banking. And interestingly, after 1840 and 1842, you had the Bank of Western India, set up by Framji, Kavasji, Jagannath Shankar Sheth, and I think there were some of these prominent people, which went on to become the Oriental Bank, and later the Oriental Banking Corporation, which became one of the biggest banks in the world. It straddled the entire world from San Francisco to Yokohama. They had their operations. And the Oriental Bank also became the note issue bank in Ceylon. And in 1884 or so, when the Oriental Bank collapsed, there was total crisis in Sri Lanka because, people's money, whatever was they held, became worthless. So very interesting. They pioneered.
Each of these points can be a discussion, but I'll have to rein it in. Yeah. I will have to rein it in. Also skip a couple of decades and keep some open space for audience questions also. But Sifra, you make the point, and that's the larger point that you make in the book, that Mumbai or Bombay, that's a better term to use for that early part. Bombay was at the epicenter, or not at the epicenter, but very linked with the global marketplace, right? The global networks. And it continued to do so till 1947. It took a break, and then it resurrects itself in 1990, post-liberalization, where it becomes back to this. And the point that you raise is that it had all its consulates, it had all its foreign merchants, it had everything. Of course, in the decades post-independence, pre-liberalization, it kind of became known more for the Bombay Club than Bombay as a cosmopolitan, interconnected city. And now you've resurrected it. So for me, what stands out for Bombay, and in journalists often talk about the great spirit of Bombay and all that. All that is great. But I also think it's a city that's so focused on marching ahead, it keeps rejuvenating itself. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of the Bombay that I know. What are your thoughts?
I'll talk from the point of view of the book. And one of the reasons I looked at the consulates, actually, Minnie, was basically to say that, when you sort of free up trade, it's not been, the old structures which were there, between the 1960s, 70s, 80s, they've been dismantled to a great extent. And we find that, again, the city is attracting the same consulates which are there. Like, for example, the city of Hamburg consulate. We have the Norway, the Swedish consulates coming. They were there in colonial Bombay. And they've now opened in the 2000s. Why have they come here? They've come here because of the opportunities. They've come here more for trade. Most of the consulate histories that I've covered opened as trade commission offices and then grew up to be a consulate and then became a consulate general. So then they have a trade commissioner, they have a political commissioner, whatever. So I found it interesting that these were these sort of markers that indicated that the city is attracting, what it should be attracting. It is India's financial center. It's attracting international trade. And it's not just attracting trade, but people are looking to the business community here investing in their countries. That was another aspect which I found. Like, for example, one of the consulates I went to, he said that we are looking to attract investment into our country. And this was a Western consulate, this was a European consulate. So it's interesting to know that Bombay is attracting business again. It's back in business in a big way. Of course, there's a long way to go. And we should think bigger than what we're thinking right now. We shouldn't think
but
of
Sifra, I think it's also a city that is, constrained. And I think Manjeet will agree with me. The focus is now shifting to Bangalore for new enterprise, to Gurgaon, and, with the new ports in Gujarat. So, there is a challenge.
I think Minnie out here, I think there's a little distinction. I think Bombay is more of services, financial services, commercial services center. I think Basil would agree with me.
Yeah,
it's
that's
attracting the
because
old
the RBI,
insurance,
all the big banks,
even the foreign insurance companies are coming, the foreign banks. I was amazed to see the number of foreign banks, the latest for the listing. There were so many of them, and some of old names, and some of them, of course, come as merged entities. So the banking, the insurance, the commercial services, the accountancy, the legal services, stock market, finance.
I think the jury is out.
Yeah,
but let's wait another 20 years.
For startups.
Let's wait another 20 years and see which way it's going, because these are interesting times.
I guess so.
Let's take some questions from the audience and then take forward. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
And also tourism is non-existent in Mumbai, like Delhi and other parts. So any comments were the British responsible for internationalization of Bombay, and with their departure did it become uninternationalized or?
One aspect of it that a lot of the communities left because they were unsure about what would happen with an Indian government post 47. They were a little more settled with the British government, foreign government, etc. That's one of the biggest reasons why a large number of them also decided to leave, particularly the Baghdadi Jews who went away. And Israel was, of course, pulling them in quite a bit. But the fear of not knowing what the future held did definitely play a big part.
Also, with the colonial networks, they were far more integrated with the world, and they were part of the colonial ecosystem. And when the British went, I think,
Under
it
the
was
British
logical.
Empire.
Yeah, it was the British Empire, right?
Just one aspect, I mean, this is a different way of looking at colonialism. I mean, it's got a lot of bad aspects to it, but it just sort of integrated so many different parts of the world. So all these communities were part. There were older networks, of course, but they became part of these colonial networks. There was sort of, I mean, it was just finance, it was merchants, brides, labor, all of them went through these networks. So when this colonial network sort of collapsed post-independence, as it were, and different parts of the world, everyone began looking in a bit. I mean, putting it very simplistically. And I think the city lost its international flavor because, as Rashida rightly said, because I know for the Baghdadi Jews at least, they were very uncertain about the future of India. And most of them went to the Western countries like London, like England, Israel, they went to Australia, the US. So, and that happened with a lot of the Chinese left after the 62 war. So it just, I mean, it's just that the whole ecosystem collapsed. Bombay was important. It was the most important city east of Suez, but it's got a different meaning also. It was a node. It was a node for finance. It was a node for transshipment. One doesn't realize that a port is not just for export and import. Goods used to come from East Africa to Bombay and then go to England and then go to other parts of the world. For example, the ivory trade from East Africa. Ivory would come, Indian merchants would send it here to Bombay. When it could go easily directly to England, even in the 1860s, right up to 1890s, ivory would come to Bombay, then it would be sorted, and then it would be sent all over the world. So ports like even say Dubai today or even Mumbai today, they are transshipment nodes. So that is important. So it was a node for finance, it was a node for trade, it was a node for transshipment. I mean, it was the center where goods came here, collected, and were sent to different parts of the world without exactly being absorbed by the local market or the Indian market.
Yeah, but I think there's another aspect to that. I mean, we could well have been the Hong Kong or Singapore, which we didn't, because at that time the policy was also much more inward looking. We were putting barriers rather than, opening up trade. And I think that's something that the city has suffered. Yeah. Any other questions?
You said that the Bombay took off because of the cotton trade. That was the reason. Now for the opium trade, the China was near to the Calcutta. So why the Calcutta couldn't help took off because for the opium? Because the Bombay, all the opium comes from the Bombay and all the way comes from the around.
It came from Malwa.
It came from both. The Patna opium went out from Calcutta, and that was the first one. But because, again, the same problem, the hinterland didn't belong to the East India Company, so Malwa opium had to be, you had to sort of negotiate with the local princes, and then once the Malwa opium started coming through Bombay, that was huge volumes of it. But otherwise, Calcutta took the opium, they had a monopoly, the East India Company had a monopoly on Bengal opium. Nobody else could buy it. But it's once the Malwa opium starts coming here, and it all links in again. The opening of the road, the opening of the faster, ships, the steamships coming in. And the 1833, where the Charter Act of 1833 allows others to now takes away the East India Company's monopoly with China, that is where it changes. And then you have Parsi, merchants, banyas, others taking chests and chests, entire ships filled with opium. 40,000 chests of opium, 64 kilos a chest per year from Bombay.
Many a fortune was made.
Many a fortune,
Fortune was
many
made.
a school, hospital, building that you go to even today in Bombay is from opium money. They would have been drug lords in another time.
Another aspect is that Malwa opium was also preferred by the peasant. The Chinese peasant was cheaper also.
And
so
large
it
bulk,
competed
right?
quite well with Bengal, but merchants in Bombay, the Bombay merchants, all sort of, they dealt in Bengal and Malwa. So it was...
They set up their
yeah,
branches were
their
in
branches
Calcutta.
were all over.
Right, yes.
Hi, thanks for this discussion. You mentioned a lot of communities. I was very curious to know about Marwadis in Bombay. Is this a post-independence phenomenon, or do you see them also in the 19th and 20th century?
Lots of Marwadis in Bombay, huge Marwadi families coming from Rajasthan here in
But
Bombay.
this is a very interesting question because I was talking to Geeta Piramal and her great-grandfather. So every time there was a famine in Marwad, a whole lot of Marwadis came in, either to Calcutta or to Bombay. And I think that was, and I remember her telling me that her great-great-grandfather came in a camel all the way and then walked half the way because it was really difficult. And all the migrations out of Rajasthan were along the lines of these famines. But yeah, there's a sizable Marwadi population over here.
Community aspect is very important. You have one person coming from Gujarat or Marwad here, and then slowly, the rest of the village will come here. They will be absorbed into the business, into the trade. They will be taught skills, and this worked for all the communities.
There's one more aspect about the Marwadis. There was a family that I sort of studied a little deeply. They had their network because Marwadis were mostly into money lending and different, commission agents, whatever. They had their network. This one family had its network all the way. The main hub was Calcutta, but that was all across the Indo-Gangetic Plain into Rajasthan where their home villages were, right to Bombay, right down to South India, and they were heavily into the Burmese trade at that time, into the rice trade.
But actually the Marwadi story goes even further back because when the Mughals expanded the empire under Akbar, most of the money, the managers of their canteens for the army were Marwadis. Yes. And that's why even today in the army, the entire canteen network is run by Marwadis. It's a very interesting parallel. When we were doing this story on the Marwadis and the rise of enterprise, we realized this. It's fascinating because that's how they spread across India. It was with the armies that they went.
Murshidabad was set up almost entirely by the Riots.
Yes, absolutely.
So became one of the biggest bankers.
Any other questions? Yes.
Sifra, you talk about Mercantile Bombay, but all these communities have also been very philanthropic. What has been their contribution to the development of the ethos of Bombay?
I would have loved to touch upon that arena, but there was word constraints for the book, I would say. I could write, I would have ideally written an 85,000 word book, but I had great, if Manjeet can, she was constantly on my neck. It had to be down to exactly 45,000 words. So all these communities, the business leaders and, the people who built their temples or synagogues or mosques, these people not only did it for the community, did it for the city too. So if you see that most of the institutions have different communities, like for example the Bombay Panjapol. I was just reading an article that came the other day saying that it was Jamshedji Jiji Boy and Amichand Motichand who built the Bombay Panjapol, for animal care, it's very, things like that. For example, even you take the Royal Institute of Science, it was Sir Jacob Sassoon and it was Sir Kavasi Jahangir. Gateway of India, there are 5 or 6 people, they'd be either for the Khoja community, Jewish, Parsi. So everyone pitched in to build the city, and more so in Bombay than in Calcutta. So there was a much greater sense of giving back in the city than it was actually in other cities, you know.
Compared to the vibrant Chinatown presence in Kolkata and other places, or even other metro cities all over the world, how do you explain the absence of a vibrant Chinatown in Mumbai?
I can make that. Yeah. You know, Bombay never had a really large Chinese presence, but Bombay was considered the last port. Now, the Chinese came here as sojourners. That means initially it was that they would come from Canton. You know, after the first Opium War, a lot of them went to Hong Kong. From Hong Kong, they went to Southeast Asia. This is the famous Chinese overseas community. And Bombay was considered the last port of call because it was easy to get a ship back to Canton or to their, you know, hometown. So Bombay never had a very large Chinese presence, not compared to Calcutta. Calcutta was huge. But a lot of them came here for work, and a lot of them were employed in the dockyard, in the Mazgaon docks. In fact, many of them came, they were trained, there was, where the current Chinese temple is, was actually a workshop for Chinese people who came. It taught them the skills so they could get employment in the dockyards. What really killed, of course, Mazgaon is the old Chinatown. The new Chinatown is in Kamatipura, where they had a Chinese club, a Mahjong club, they had a laundry, they had a grocery store. The Chinese lived in that area, and that was where they were. But what really sort of made them immigrate was the 62 war, because a lot of these people were interned in Deoli camp in Rajasthan, and then after they came back, they found that the Chinese schools at Agripada had been occupied by trespassers, and there was a certain tension, you know, so most of them started sort of immigrating overseas. And one place where you have a strong Chinese, Calcutta and Bombay presence is actually in Toronto. So they still talk Bengali, they still talk Marathi, they watch Hindi movies, they still come, keep visiting. So that connection is there because the community is concentrated there. Others, of course, have sort of merged with the other overseas Chinese communities.
But it was really sad the way we treated the Chinese after the 62 war. I think it was appalling because these whole communities were disrupted. And you were telling me, Vasil, that in Toronto apparently there is a very vibrant community.
There's a vibrant community over there. They're from the Deoli camp. And we came across this because earlier, during the First and Second World War, we had internment camps wherein citizens of enemy nations were interned, and it included, you know, multinational corporations of like Bayer and Siemens, etc., were interned. Many of them in Ahmednagar Fort, and quite a few of these places were there. So Deoli was one of those internment camps which was used in 1962.
Right. We'll wrap up the discussion here. Any more questions? Yes.
Point out that even in San Francisco, there's a very vibrant Chinese community,
Yes.
a very large community.
Yeah. I know. Chinatown is quite famous out there.
Yes, of course, Calcutta is bigger. I don't know now, but
But
when
there is still a marked Chinese. No, they're not Indian Chinese. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Chinese, there's a Chinatown pretty much. And now the Chinatown has a whole new meaning because large tracts of Africa, Sri Lanka. I went to Kenya, the Masai Mara, the entire roadways are built by the Chinese. So they're huge communities now. So let's see what the world is going to look like in the next couple of decades, right? Well, it's been a wonderful discussion, but I would like to leave all the audiences over here with one little anecdote or one little factor that makes this story of Bombay, which each one of you has studied so deeply, a personal thing for you. You know, how does it connect to you as a person? An anecdote or an aspect of the city that for you reflects this past.
Yeah, no, seriously. I don't have any personal anecdote, but it's just the fact that I started working on Bombay city by doing research on the Parsi. So I came in from another side. And then I was just fascinated with this. I mean, I live and breathe Bombay history now. But I don't know about how, that's my personal thing for me.
Right.
There's no real personal anecdote, and there's a great deal of pride doing research on Bombay and on the Parsi contribution to Bombay.
Sifra?
Mani, I think I came in the same way because I'm a Ben Israeli. So I started off, of course, I write a lot on the Jewish community in India and in Bombay in particular. So the part which really sort of opened my eyes to my history and to the city, in fact, is this little synagogue of 1796 on Samuel Street, known as the Gate of Mercy Synagogue. It was built by a Ben Israel Jew or a native commandant. And he built the synagogue, which is possibly, it was rebuilt in 1812, possibly one of the oldest structures in the city, older structures in the city. And he built this little synagogue there for his community as a thanksgiving because Tipu Sultan, he was a prisoner and brought before Tipu Sultan. And Tipu Sultan asked him for which community he belonged. And he said, I'm a Ben Israel Jew. And the mother, Tipu's mother from behind Parda said, you cannot kill him because the Ben Israelis are mentioned with great favor in the Quran. So all the Ben Israeli people in that unit were let off, the rest were killed.
Oh, wow.
And they remained in imprisonment for almost 2 years. And they went all over traveling with Tipu's army till the Cochini Jews pleaded with, the commander or general or Tipu or whatever and released this lot of people. And they were taken to Cochin. And he saw a synagogue for the first time. And he decided, he took a vow that I'm coming back to Bombay and I'm going to build a synagogue. And that is the earliest synagogue in the city.
How lovely.
So that's my little story.
Okay,
Yeah.
Basil?
I don't really have a story, but I was working with the Reserve Bank of India, and the only thing is that when the Reserve Bank of India was set up in Calcutta, it had to shift its headquarters later. They shifted the headquarters not to Delhi, but they shifted it to Bombay. Now, for multiple of reasons. One of the reasons is, of course, the cluster effect of having the markets over here, the capital markets and the money markets, and the banks over here. There was also the idea of Bombay being far removed from, the central bank should be an institution which should be a little independent of government and at arm's length, and that is perhaps one of the reasons why they shifted the headquarters.
Even I have a personal story which I must narrate to you. So I lived in Bombay from 2002 to 2017, being totally clueless about its history. Because, when you come from a city like Delhi, where history is all over, right? You have the Lodhis, you have the Delhi Sultanate. You think that that's the most historic city in the country, and you feel very, you're a little snobbish about it. But when I came to Bombay, and I started Live History India, we got to see history from the Deccan upwards, from Bombay upwards. And I must tell you, every day or every week, I just find some aspect of the city that completely wows me. And I feel that this is a city which is understated. It is a city which has its own tempo. It is a city with great respect for communities. It is a city with such a layered past that I think this is an adopted city for me, but I'm really a very proud Mumbaiker now. So I think that's a city for you. There's so many aspects of it. And I think Sifra's book kind of helps us understand the making of Bombay and the essence of the city, which continues even today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you to our panel for such an insightful discussion. I think this should be a full-day seminar, as we were saying. I could just listen to you all forever. Firstly, Minnie, thank you for so skillfully moderating the session. We've done so much work with Sifra. In fact, you all were talking about the Jewish and the Chinese communities. We have a wonderful series in partnership with Gateway House on urban legacy. So I suggest you all check it out. It's on YouTube. There's a page where all these are archived, and you get lots more information about the Israelis, the Jewish, the Portuguese, and the Iranian diaspora in Bombay. And it's a really, really special series. But thank you so much. Congratulations, Sifra, on the book. And hopefully the Urban Legacies will be made into a book next. But guys, the books are being sold. You must buy a copy and get it signed by Sifra in support. And thank you to our partners, Gateway House and Live History India, for we always do a series with Mini called Cultural Capitals. In fact, our very next program is we're going to be looking at Srinagar, which is the future legacies of India's cities. Our next program, after that in-person live program, people get confused nowadays because they're not used to this, you know, we've been Zooming for 2 years, is on NFTs. It's the NFT explosion, decoding the latest disruptor in the arts. It's going to be on the 24th, and it's going to be at a really new, cool place in Ballard Estate called Ice Factory Ballard Estate, IFB. To find out more of our programs, just stalk us on social media or check out our website. But thank you so much for making the time to come and be with us today and to, you know, bring this normalcy back to our lives, which is very needed. On that note, have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.